I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our next speaker, who is Kane Murdoch, who is currently the manager for conduct and the integrity unit at the University of New South Wales in Australia. And Kane has been over working with QQI and the Irish Higher Education over the past week or so, looking at the whole area of academic integrity. Uh, in this contribution, Kane's going to look at, I suppose, the pressures on the programs from a more unusual lens through his significant experience, knowledge, and research on supporting academic integrity through forensic detection, policy development, and implementation in University of New South Wales. So over to you, Kane.
Thank you very much, Porrig, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm just going to fire up my PowerPoint here. It'll just be a moment. But I'll introduce myself. So as Porrig said, I'm the manager of the Student Conduct and Integrity Unit at UNSW in Sydney. Now, when I say manager, my real role is as an investigator and a leader of investigators into serious misconduct. Now, and as we've kind of adapted to COVID and, you know, the changes wrought by it, it's really shown us a new lens into academic integrity as practice and how students might perceive that. But it's also given us what I believe is a reasonably unique insight into the effect that these issues have on assessment, have on the modular structure of learning, and hence on programs. As Porrig also said, I spent all of last week sharing my knowledge with HEIs in Ireland, nominally on the detection of contract cheating, but the conversations broadened out quite a lot over the week with the different audiences. And I think I've kind of managed to distill some of my thoughts about that in the days since, and so I wanted to share that with you. So, in my view, contract cheating, obviously it's a significant issue, and there's no sense in which I would ever downplay it. But I think it's more of an indicator, perhaps a leading indicator, but an indicator nonetheless, about some of the issues that we face. And, you know, for example, in other integrity concerns right now, there's research being done by colleagues such as Thomas Lancaster into artificial intelligence and the writing of essays via AI means. And it seems to me that we will continue to face these kind of issues, and we can't continue to react to them. We will be engaged in a kind of arms race, which we probably won't win. So what my experience has shown me is that students, you know, when they cheat, it isn't some sort of moral collapse. You know, we think about cheating in quite moralistic terms. However, in my experience, students who contract cheat and even other forms of cheating, most often they're either uninterested in learning or they're incapable of learning at the standards that we require. You know, it's our system of assessment which actually allows them to progress regardless. And we can put all kinds of extreme measures in place to try to secure assessment, but in doing so, we can quite often kind of bend or pervert our assessment. And so I believe that, you know, cheating is in large part a result of design flaw, but it's not one made at the modular level. You know, I think it's a systemic flaw in many institutions, and it's one that we don't interrogate very often. So to give you a sense of the scale of the things that I'm talking about, we have a tendency to believe that cheating is rare and egregious, and that's, you know, in many places, especially the case with plagiarism, because we haven't had exposure to more extreme, more advanced forms of cheating. We think that plagiarism is a very severe breach of student codes, and we think it's a rare thing. However, research doesn't really support this. So research from Australia indicates that 10% roughly of students, and we've had at least 2 studies that have come to around that kind of number. About 10% of students are engaged in contract cheating, and there's no reason to believe that Ireland or the UK or any similar types of higher ed sectors are any different. So given our commonalities, we're educated, we're wealthy, we're attractive to students from around the world, and we speak English. So in other words, I'm saying that, serious misconduct is simply not as rare as we commonly believe, and plagiarism does not fall into that category of serious misconduct. I'd also add that since COVID, it's all the more so not a rare event, it's disturbingly common. So as you'll see on screen there, when we turned our mind to looking at contract cheating, we very quickly were able to develop techniques and to find it at scale. So, and since then we've continued to develop, but there's been a noticeable lack of action across, or coordinated action, let's say, across the sector until recently. And I will highlight that QQI are, in my view, leading Europe on this. So what that process has kind of indicated to me is that we rely on certain assumptions in higher education. And one of these is that all of our students are engaged with the education system purely to learn. We might kind of reflect that students are aiming at a career and education is a means to an end. But as people engaged and committed to education, we want to believe that students are here primarily to learn. But my experience of many students, and not only those who engage in academic misconduct, is that the assumption may well be erroneous. And it's an observation, not a criticism as such. Young learners are trained to aim for marks well before they arrive at our gates, during their secondary schooling and perhaps even earlier. When they enter university, it strikes me that we don't transform their thinking. We actually further reinforce it when we discuss assessment early in the first weeks of a module, because even in the teacher's mind, they're somewhat focused on assessment as the demonstrable output of the module rather than demonstrated learning. So another of the assumptions that we have in higher education is that marks are analogous to learning. We award marks and we link these explicitly to learning outcomes. And it's an assumption that we should explore. When a student successfully contracts out assessment to a third party and we fail to detect it, for example, the submission is graded, and presuming the student passes the module, we naturally assume that the student achieved the learning outcomes for that module. Of course, in that scenario, it is probably more accurate to say that little to nothing was learned at all. Similarly, when students are able to collude during an exam, an online exam in particular, our estimation of the learning achieved is misguided, but we're unaware of it. Sorry, folks. So, however, even our finest students, they can be awfully focused on what comes after university than what happens while they're there. They may see university as a ticket to the career in front of them, and they may be placing a much higher importance on marks than we can really perceive. And they might also place a less explicit importance on learning as a good in and of itself. And I'll give you an example. So this is from a kind of student Facebook group, an open public one. And you'll see there, could someone recommend me a WAM booster science elective? And the concept of a WAM booster, which is a weighted average mark. It's like a GPA. That tells us that even students who are most likely to complete, who there are no integrity concerns over, who are most likely to complete their assigned assessments individually, they can often choose modules. And this is not an isolated incident. This is a very common kind of question. They may choose modules according to the belief that the module will benefit their average and not necessarily out of any interest in the module itself. And it strikes me that designing and delivering modules in programs with that assumption that learning is the primary goal of all students is flawed. Indeed, for those students engaged in serious misconduct, they may actually be incapable of learning at the standards we expect, but how far does the disinterest in learning extend into the broader student body? So another example, during COVID, most institutions, we pivoted early in COVID and transferred our assessment online with little further development. And that's totally understandable. People had days to change their whole course. However, the changes wrought by COVID, they're unlikely to disappear. Learning and teaching are likely to continue to be mediated to a significant degree by the internet. And it also strikes me that we need to deal with that reality. Again, from my perspective, witnessing the pointy end of misconduct, I do not believe that we'll successfully reverse our way into the future to fix these problems. The default to take everything back to exams, and that has a kind of logical conclusion with 100% exams if we're going to provide or going to believe in true assessment security. But, I think we need to move forward into the future rather than engaging in an arms race with our own students and cheating services who prey upon our students. It's really important for us to keep in mind our students and their best interests, and we can only really realise those when we discuss them with students. But we also must act in concert to address the issues and not react over and over to emerging issues. As I said, we'll be chasing our tails to a fair extent. So in fact, and I'm going to take another step forward here, I would argue that through decades, we've engaged in a kind of trial and error process to shape assessment around modules, and we adapt to new technologies, but each module heads in its own direction to a reasonable extent, according to the taste of those responsible for it. So on a program level, it seems to me that we've built the assessment of programs on an unsound base. So although many academics teach and assess with a close eye on the future, institutionally, we have a tendency to revert to tradition. And so we have built a house, we've called it assessment, with various forms of assessment added on, like new wings and coats of paint, but it's forever tied to the rickety base. And as integrity issues grow in severity, and contract cheating is obviously a very severe issue, and AI is an emerging but likely to be severe issue. Our house is, from my vantage point, it's concerningly unstable. So as I said earlier, we break programs into modules, and within those modules, we break the assessment down into chunks. And at this point, I think it's worth asking the question, is assessment getting in the way of learning? Are the mechanics of assessment and marks and grades actually getting in the way of students' learning? And I'll repeat, I'm of the view that many students, one might say especially high-performing students, come to us pre-programmed to aim for marks, and learning is in many ways a byproduct rather than the primary product of their education. And we've enabled this through our own assessment structures and processes. So commonly we respond to these concerns by going better assessment design, more assessment design, as if we can design out imperfections in our system. However, that approach has led to the rickety house. And incidentally, there is research indicating that assessment design, is not a remedy for contract cheating. So we try flawed approaches to fix problems. So it strikes me that continually patching the house and making small disconnected changes to assessment is a doomed effort. We need to start thinking about programs not as a series of chunks, but as an integrated whole. And that's challenging thinking. I'm fully aware. But that the whole needs to meet learning requirements, assessment requirements, regulatory requirements, but also integrity requirements. And I can hear you thinking, but Kane, the task is too large. It will be years of work, and I understand. But unless we can start thinking and acting bravely to secure the future of our programs, I'm of the view that further instabilities will emerge and the choices will no longer be in our hands. So I put it to you that given these various known issues, and they're just the known ones, with our current arrangements, and I would also add cost is high at the moment. It is an imperative that senior leaders in higher education, act bravely. They inspire their people to act bravely. We need to think a bit seriously about whether the module structure is still fit for purpose. And if not, we need to explore alternatives, integrated programs and fleshing out what that looks like. We need to show students the importance of the linkages and turn their focus on marks and grades back towards the learning process. In the first inside, suggest the following: don't give any marks in first year. Don't mark or grade in first year. Give only feedback on formative assessment. By doing this, we can change the game. We change the students' mindsets. We reduce misconduct, and I would argue to zero, because there's no benefit to doing it. And we reduce our costs, both in financial terms and in staff terms. Staff can focus on teaching and learning rather than assessment as such, or at least assessment is more integrated into those processes. While I typically keep my opinions on the act and the method, I'm a professional staff member and I don't teach courses, but I typically keep my opinions on the act and the method of teaching or assessment to myself. I can see that at a high level, our approaches to assessment security in the current age are also flawed. Virtually all forms of assessment that are not in person can be cheated, and even some of those can be. But they can be cheated, they can be contracted, and they can be otherwise perverted. And research supports this, and my experience of handling serious misconduct cases also supports this. However, if we were to take the perhaps radical steps I just described, we can achieve a better balance between learning and assessment, security and costs and other factors which we currently do not fully account for. For example, while I'm not a proponent of exams myself, with an emphasis on formative learning throughout large parts of a student's degree, a formative learning without marks and grades, a formal sit-down exam and aligned with perhaps other forms of secure assessment can ensure that the integrity of our degrees, while we also support the deep learning, which we hope every student receives. And we will have achieved a better balance between the various forces being applied to us. And finally, we use integrity as a catch-all, one that reflects on bad students. But as a former colleague of mine once said, cheating is not the thing that bad kids do at uni. Cheating is the bad thing that kids do at uni. And we have contributed to that. We've contributed to the prevalence of that bad thing. As I say, we need to be aiming for a better balance, fully accounting for all those factors in education and not just those we can easily measure. And undertaking that accounting, we can move toward a place where we can be more assured, and our stakeholders, professional bodies, regulators, the public, and most importantly, students, can be more assured of the integrity of higher education and their degrees as a whole. Thank you very much.